As the guests gasped in disbelief, a billion-dollar wedding turned into a spectacle of heartbreak. Claire Montgomery, the only daughter of a billionaire business mogul, stood at the altar, her heart shattered, staring at the man who was supposed to be her future. But instead of the "I do" she had been dreaming of, all she heard was the deafening silence of abandonment. As she watched her fiancé walk away, leaving her standing there in front of hundreds, what would Claire do next? Could she recover from the public humiliation, or would this moment change her life forever? What happened next would make international headlines. The grand cathedral was filled with the soft murmur of excited guests, the gold chandeliers casting warm light over the rows of white chairs lined with velvet ribbons. The smell of fresh flowers lingered in the air as the doors at the back of the church slowly creaked open. The aisle, covered in delicate petals, stretched toward a lavish altar adorned with towering white lilies and soft, flickering candles. It was a perfect fairy tale setting, one that Claire Montgomery had dreamed of since she was a little girl. As the daughter of billionaire businessman Charles Montgomery, Claire had grown accustomed to luxury. Her father, a self-made magnate, had built an empire from the ground up, and she had always been the shining jewel in his life. Everything was planned to perfection for this moment, the most anticipated wedding of the year. Claire, a woman of grace and beauty, stood at the altar in her custom-made designer gown, her heart racing with anticipation. She could hardly believe that the day she had long imagined was finally here. She was marrying Andrew Carlyle, the handsome and charming heir to one of the country's most prestigious law firms. He was everything Claire had ever wanted: educated, successful, and from a family that matched her own in wealth and status. Their love story had been the talk of high society, and the wedding had been talked about for months. Everything had been prepared: the extravagant guest list, the honeymoon in the Maldives, the diamond ring that sparkled more brightly than the chandeliers above. But as Claire stood there, waiting for Andrew, her excitement slowly turned to confusion. The minutes stretched longer than she expected. Her best friend, Sophie, who stood in the front row, exchanged nervous glances with Claire's mother, Evelyn. The tension in the air became palpable, and Claire felt a sudden unease creep into her stomach. Where was Andrew? Had something gone wrong? Surely he wouldn't leave her at the altar. She couldn't believe what she was starting to fear. Suddenly, the double doors at the back of the church swung open. Andrew's best man, Thomas, entered with a solemn look on his face. He approached Claire, his eyes avoiding hers. "I'm sorry, Claire. Andrew won't be coming," he said quietly, his voice trembling. The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Her heart stopped. She searched his face for a hint of a joke, something to show this was a misunderstanding. But his expression remained firm, and Claire felt her knees go weak. The entire church was silent. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire turned to look at her father, whose face had drained of color. Charles Montgomery, a man who had built a business empire and conquered the world of high society, now stood helpless as his daughter was abandoned by the man he had welcomed into their family. Andrew's absence left Claire standing alone at the altar, her carefully constructed world suddenly shattering. Her vision blurred with tears, but she held her ground. She was not going to let this moment define her. But what could she do? She was a billionaire's daughter, expected to be graceful in moments of crisis. But in that moment, Claire felt completely exposed and vulnerable. The silence in the room was suffocating. The entire wedding was a fiasco. But Claire had one thing that none of the others had: her father's grit, the ability to rise from the ashes. What would Claire do next? Would she let the humiliation of this public rejection define her? Or would she use it to change the course of her life forever? The story was only just beginning. The church was still silent when Claire turned away from the altar, her eyes locked on the ground. Her heart felt as if it had fallen into a bottomless pit. Every inch of her body trembled as she made her way back down the aisle, ignoring the shocked gazes of the guests. She could hear the faint whispers behind her, but she couldn't bring herself to face anyone. The extravagant ceremony, the stunning dress, the dream life she had planned, none of it mattered now. It was all a lie. Outside, the summer sun beat down mercilessly, but Claire hardly noticed the heat. The elegant black town car that had been waiting for her stood at the curb. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a definitive click. It was as if the world had shifted, and she was the only one left standing in the aftermath. Her father, Charles Montgomery, arrived moments later, getting into the car beside her. His face was pale, his usually strong demeanor shattered. They didn't say anything at first. There was nothing left to say. When they arrived back at the Montgomery estate, the sprawling mansion that had been the backdrop to Claire's life for as long as she could remember, Claire was ready to collapse. She could hear her father's footsteps behind her as she made her way through the grand entryway. Their house was a monument to wealth and power, but now, in the wake of the broken wedding, it felt hollow and cold. She barely registered the servants' concerned glances as they passed her on their way to the kitchen. Her mother, Evelyn Montgomery, met her at the door with tears in her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," Evelyn said, reaching for her. "I'm so sorry. We'll get through this." Claire shook her head. "I don't want your sympathy, Mum. I don't want anyone's pity. Her voice trailed off. It was too much. The whole thing felt like a betrayal of herself, her family, and everything she had worked so hard to build. "I just don't know what to do now." Her mother pulled her into an embrace, but Claire felt nothing. It was a hollow gesture. Nothing could undo the hurt that was gnawing at her insides. The life she had envisioned, one of luxury, admiration and respect, was slipping through her fingers. For the next few days, Claire did what she did best: retreat into herself. She stayed in her room, surrounded by the opulence that used to make her feel secure, but now felt suffocating. Her father tried to reach out, but Claire avoided his calls. The media frenzy surrounding her abandoned wedding had reached its peak, with headlines screaming about the billionaire's daughter left at the altar. But Claire wasn't interested in the world's sympathy. She didn't care what the public thought. She was angry, confused, and above all, hurt. Andrew Carlyle, the man she had been set to marry, had shattered her trust. He hadn't just broken a promise. He had destroyed the carefully constructed life she had envisioned. But there was something more sinister in Andrew's absence, a sense of betrayal that Claire couldn't shake. What had really happened? One evening, after days of solitude, Claire finally broke her silence. She called Sophie, her best friend since childhood, and asked her to meet at the estate. Sophie was like a sister to her, someone who had always understood the pressures of being in the public eye, the weight of expectation, and the unspoken demands of being part of a wealthy family. If anyone could offer Claire the kind of support she needed, it was Sophie. As they sat together in Claire's sunroom, sipping tea, Claire poured out her feelings of confusion and frustration. "Sophie, I just don't get it. Andrew, I thought he loved me. I thought we were building a life together." She paused, trying to hold back tears. "But now I'm left here, humiliated, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life." Sophie reached for her hand, her voice soft. "You need to stop blaming yourself, Claire. This isn't about you. Andrew left you for reasons that have nothing to do with who you are as a person. You've got to look beyond this." Claire shook her head. "You don't understand. He was supposed to be my future. He was everything I wanted, and now I'm nothing. I have nothing." "You have everything, Claire," Sophie said, her words filled with urgency. "You have power, influence, and the ability to change everything. Don't let this break you." Claire's chest tightened as Sophie's words sank in. It was true. She had always had the resources to carve her own path. She didn't need to depend on anyone for validation. She was Claire Montgomery, the daughter of one of the richest men in the world. But that wasn't the issue, was it? It wasn't about money or status. It was about trust, love, and the betrayal she now faced. The question gnawed at her. What was Andrew hiding? Why had he left her in front of hundreds of people? Sophie leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. "I think it's time we found out the truth." Over the next few days, Claire took matters into her own hands. She enlisted Sophie's help to look into Andrew's past. Together, they dug through social media accounts, old family connections, and business associates. The search led them to an unsettling discovery. Andrew had been involved in several shady business dealings, ones that Claire's family had never been told about. It seemed that Andrew's sudden decision to call off the wedding wasn't just about Claire. It was tied to his desperate need to clean up his own mess. But he hadn't been honest with her. Instead, he had left her to take the fall in front of everyone. The betrayal stung, but it also ignited a spark within Claire. She wasn't just going to sit back and let this ruin her life. No, this would be the turning point in her journey. The girl who had always lived in the shadow of her father's empire was about to step into the light and take control of her own story. Claire wasn't going to be defined by Andrew's lies or her father's wealth. She was going to rebuild herself, brick by brick. With Sophie by her side, Claire called a meeting with her father's lawyers and began the process of reclaiming her narrative. She would expose Andrew's deceit, reveal the truth behind his abandonment, and turn the public's perception of her into a force for change. She would use her family's influence for something greater than luxury. The world would see her strength, her resilience, and her ability to rise from the ashes of betrayal. Her first step was to release a statement, one that would rock the media and force the truth to the surface. She was no longer the woman scorned. She was the woman who would make her own destiny. As the media caught wind of her investigation, Claire's name became synonymous with power and determination. The public was fascinated by her transformation from the abandoned bride to the woman who refused to be a victim. Headlines shifted, and Claire's name began to trend for all the right reasons. She wasn't just a billionaire's daughter anymore. She was an icon of strength, taking control of her life and her future. What began as a public humiliation became the spark for Claire's ultimate revolution. She had been abandoned at the altar, but she had found a new purpose, a new life. Now the world was watching as she turned tragedy into triumph, proving that the only thing more powerful than betrayal was the will to rise from it. As Claire's journey of redemption and self-discovery continued, she found herself standing taller than ever before, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days following Claire's decision to confront Andrew's betrayal felt like a slow, tense build-up to something inevitable. The media frenzy was far from over, but Claire had successfully shifted the narrative. No longer was she the woman left at the altar, humiliated and abandoned. She had become the symbol of resilience and power, an heir to a fortune, yes, but more importantly, a woman who was determined to forge her own path. Every interview, every statement released, every new revelation she uncovered about Andrew only cemented her transformation. But Claire wasn't done yet. She knew there was one more step she had to take, and it was the most dangerous one. Claire had made a plan that would shake the foundations of Andrew's carefully constructed life. It wasn't enough to simply expose him publicly. She needed him to feel the full weight of his deception. She needed to show him and everyone just how far she would go to reclaim her power. She had to make a statement. The final confrontation would be at the charity gala her father's company was sponsoring. It was the most anticipated event of the year, with the richest and most influential people in the world attending. Claire had never been interested in the glitz and glamour of it all, but this time she was going to use the spotlight for something far greater than a show of wealth. The night of the gala arrived, and Claire stood before the full-length mirror in her dressing room, her fingers brushing over the emerald green gown that clung to her frame like it had been made just for her. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup understated but elegant. But despite the perfection of her appearance, there was a storm brewing inside her. This wasn't just about looking the part. It was about reclaiming her narrative, about finally stepping into her own power. Tonight, she was no longer the abandoned bride. She was Claire Montgomery, fierce, unapologetic, and in control. As she made her way downstairs to the grand ballroom, she saw her father waiting at the foot of the staircase. Charles Montgomery, always the pillar of strength, stood with his usual air of authority. But tonight there was something different about him. He looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you sure about this, Claire?" he asked, his voice low. Claire paused, looking into her father's eyes. She could see the hesitation there, the concern that his daughter was about to stir up a storm far greater than she could handle. "I have to, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "This is the only way. I won't let him get away with it." Charles sighed, but nodded, his gaze softening. "Just remember, you're doing this for you, not for anyone else. It's your story now." With that, Claire stepped into the ballroom, the high heels of her shoes clicking against the marble floor. The lights above were dimmed in favor of the soft, golden glow from the chandeliers, casting an air of grandeur over the lavish crowd gathered below. The chatter of excited guests buzzed in her ears, but Claire barely noticed. She was focused, laser-focused, on the man who had torn apart everything she had believed in, Andrew Carlyle. Andrew was standing near the center of the room, laughing easily with a few high-profile businessmen. His perfectly pressed suit, his charming smile, everything about him screamed confidence. The man who had left her at the altar, the man who had orchestrated her public humiliation, was now enjoying the very thing he had taken from her: power. Claire could feel her pulse quicken as she approached him. He hadn't noticed her yet, too engrossed in his conversation. She didn't need him to see her just yet. She needed to be in position. As Claire walked toward the bar, she saw Sophie across the room. Sophie gave her a subtle nod, letting Claire know that everything was in place. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly, every detail, every move carefully calculated. It was time. "Andrew!" Claire called out as she approached him. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that immediately grabbed his attention. He turned, his face lighting up with that all-too-familiar smile. "Claire, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone smooth, almost mocking. "You didn't expect to see me here?" Claire repeated, taking a step closer. "You've been running from me for months, from the truth." Andrew's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "I think we've had enough of this conversation, don't you? Let's just leave things in the past." Claire's eyes narrowed. "I don't think we can leave things in the past when your secrets are about to catch up with you." The room around them seemed to blur as Claire spoke, her words cutting through the noise of the gala like a hot knife. She knew that every eye in the room would be on them now. The stakes had never been higher. "You can't hide from the truth forever, Andrew," she continued, her voice strong, steady. "And tonight, the truth will come out." Andrew's demeanor shifted. He had the look of a man who realized he was no longer in control. "What are you talking about?" "I know about the deals you've been making behind my back," Claire said, her voice rising slightly. "I know about your shady business ventures and how you've been using our wedding as a cover-up for your failures." For a moment, Andrew said nothing. His face twisted into a mask of anger, but Claire could see the fear in his eyes. She had him. "You're just trying to ruin me, Claire," he hissed. "You think this makes you strong? This is just your way of getting back at me." "No, Andrew," Claire said softly, almost pityingly. "This isn't about getting back at you. This is about exposing you for everything you are." Claire reached into her purse and pulled out a folder, holding it up for him to see. It was filled with documents, emails, contracts, bank statements. Proof of Andrew's corruption, his lies, and his manipulation. Claire handed the folder to Andrew, her eyes not leaving his face. She knew he would try to deny it, but there was no escaping the truth now. As Andrew took the folder, his hands trembled. The room around them seemed to grow even quieter as he scanned the documents, his face pale as the weight of his own betrayal sank in. The businessmen who had been standing nearby had stopped talking and were now watching the scene unfold with bated breath. "You think this is enough?" Andrew sneered. "You think you can ruin me with this?" "I don't need to ruin you, Andrew," Claire replied, her voice unwavering. "You've done that yourself." The crowd was silent. The tension in the air was thick as Claire stood there, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had exposed him. But there was one more thing she needed to do. As Andrew turned, his face twisted in anger, Claire moved swiftly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a microphone. She turned toward the guests, her gaze sweeping over the sea of shocked faces. "I want everyone to hear this," Claire said, her voice amplified by the microphone. "This man, Andrew Carlisle, thought he could break me, humiliate me, and walk away with his reputation intact. But the truth is more powerful than any lie." She turned back to Andrew, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You'll never be able to run from this. This is my story now, and I'm not afraid to take control." As Claire's words echoed through the grand ballroom, the reality of what had just happened settled over the room. The truth had come to light, and Claire Montgomery, the woman who had been left standing at the altar, had risen from the ashes, stronger than ever before. The silence was broken by the sound of applause, slow at first, tentative, but then growing louder and louder until the entire room was clapping. Claire had won. She had turned betrayal into triumph, and her journey of self-empowerment had only just begun. As the months passed, Claire's life began to transform in ways she hadn't expected. The fallout from the gala was immense, but in ways that were entirely out of Andrew's control. The media, initially stunned by the drama of her public confrontation, quickly began to shift its focus to Claire's resilience, her strength in the face of betrayal, and her unapologetic embrace of her own story. Headlines that once painted her as the abandoned daughter of a billionaire began to celebrate her as a powerful woman in her own right, a force to be reckoned with, not because of her family's wealth, but because of her unyielding determination to reclaim control over her life. Andrew, on the other hand, found himself at the center of a scandal that spread far beyond the walls of their circle. His business deals were investigated, and his personal relationships came under scrutiny. The lies he had spun to protect his own interests unraveled in the most public way possible, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions. Claire, however, never took pleasure in his downfall. In fact, there was no joy in seeing him fall. It was simply the result of his own choices. Betrayal had consequences, and Claire was no longer part of his narrative. In the aftermath, Claire's family also saw changes. Her father, Charles, once fiercely protective of his daughter's image, began to see her not as the fragile girl who needed his protection, but as a woman who had earned her place in the world. The bond between them deepened in ways that Claire hadn't anticipated. Charles, ever the businessman, was proud of his daughter's strength, but it was the quiet moments they shared after the storm had passed that meant the most. Their conversations were no longer about business, but about life, about choices, and about the power of moving forward from hardship. Claire also found herself becoming a mentor to others. She reached out to women who had faced betrayal and heartbreak, offering them a safe space to share their experiences. The charity that had once been a mere feature of her family's brand now became her platform for change. She used her voice to fight for causes she believed in, from mental health to social justice, creating a network that supported those who needed a voice, just as she had once needed. But perhaps the greatest transformation was within Claire herself. The young woman who had once been defined by her family's legacy, her upcoming marriage, and her place in the social hierarchy, was now a woman defined by her own journey, one of strength, vulnerability, and unapologetic authenticity. The world had tried to tell her who she should be, and she had refused. Instead, she wrote her own story. And in doing so, she inspired others to do the same. The moral of Claire's journey was clear. Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan. People may let you down, and the world may feel like it's falling apart. But the true power lies in how you rise from that moment. Claire didn't let betrayal define her. She used it as the catalyst for her own reinvention. The takeaway for the audience was simple, yet profound. Your story is yours to write. No one can take that away from you, not even the people you love or the ones who hurt you. And in the end, it's not about what you lose, but how you rebuild, rise, and thrive that truly matters. As Claire looked out over the city from her penthouse balcony, the wind gently tousling her hair, she smiled to herself. The future was wide open, and for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid of the unknown.